Welcome to Orchestrating Outcomes, a new video series brought to you by TraceLink that explores the challenges and opportunities of supply chain digitalization, featuring insights from industry leaders across the pharmaceutical supply chain. My name is Henry Ames, and I'm responsible for the logistics orchestration here at TraceLink, and I am thrilled today to be joined by Michael Sweeney. Michael is the global head of strategy for QuickSTAT, and I've had the great honor of knowing Mike for the better part of the last 20 years or so, and he's got more than 30 years of experience in the industry. So we're very lucky to have him today. Welcome, Mike.
So glad to be here, Henry. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you. Could you begin by sharing with our audience a little bit about just a brief introduction of yourself, your background, a little bit about QuickSTAT and the work you're doing at QuickSTAT? I know you're leading the cell and gene therapy division there.
Sure. At QuickSTAT, they're really, they had a great reputation in cell and gene therapy. And the more I get to know about the company, the more I'm enthralled with it and what I'm doing. I'm also responsible for direct-to-patient services. So there's a lot that goes into my role day to day, week to week. And it's been a lot of fun, a lot of challenges. But these are interesting times that we're living in with cell and gene therapy in particular.
Thank you for that. You know, when you and I talked about this series, we talked about the broader industry and some of the more interesting trends. I mean, the global healthcare logistics market's projected to grow roughly 17% from 130 billion in 2023 to almost 155 billion in 2026, depending on what numbers you look at. And when you break that down, the industry is characterized by a number of sort of unique factors: higher growth rates than sort of your traditional automotive or aerospace or perhaps other verticals, higher margins, new therapy classes. You talked about direct to patient, direct from patient, which of course grew during the pandemic. And it's largely recession resistant. Could you share with us a little bit about sort of how is QuickSTAT looking at this market segment? What are some of the more strategic investments you're making in support of the growth of this industry?
It's a really interesting time because I think the investment was heavily going into cell and gene therapy prior to the pandemic. It's hit a few pauses and definitely changes in tact. I think there's been a lot of economic changes that have hit since as well. QuickStat's really been pretty focused in delivering the service that's required, which unfortunately is pretty tough to execute. But at the same time, it's the challenge that brings us to the table with a lot of the therapy developers and the other service providers that are supporting that requirement. At the end of the day, this is healthcare. We're talking about patients that are getting treatments that are life-changing. In some cases, they're curative. So we take that responsibility very seriously. And I think the easy thing for us to do is be able to translate that to people that work within our organization so that they understand, look, this is somebody that could be, in a situation that you've lived through. It could be a parent, it could be a relative, it could be a loved one, a friend, somebody that you know that's having a challenge and is at the end of their rope or maybe at the end of their hopeful opportunities for a treatment. And this is something that in a lot of cases is giving them more hope and giving them the possibility that wasn't there, maybe even just a few months or certainly a few years before. So it's challenging in executing because there is a lot at stake for every single shipment. So what QuickStat's really kind of looking at in terms of investment is our infrastructure, our people. Where are we located? What types of services do our customers need that require brick and mortar, that require refilling, for example, of liquid nitrogen dewars, packaging. You and I go back a long ways in the packaging and temperature monitoring arenas, and that's very much at play here, and that technology has advanced substantially. So those are things that we consistently look at. We're also looking at technology. What do we need to do? How can we be better? How can we be more integrated? And it's interesting for me because I'm probably spending more time with our kind of vendors or suppliers, but also others that are in this space, such as a company like TraceLink, and figure out ways that we can work together to make this more streamlined process for the people that are frankly trying to support patients that are in need. we've got a lot of really great people out there in the healthcare provider space that need a lot of help and assistance in technology with automation, with more, ability to see what's going on with a critical shipment that's incoming for a patient that they may be caring for. So there are fundamental pieces around the infrastructure, the technology, but also our investments and our partnerships, which again, there's a crossover there with the technology sector, but there's so many more partnerships that we invest heavily in, whether it's a service provider, a customer relationship, a relationship that may potentially go both ways. And kind of, we are always looking for the best in class to make sure that our service is going to be aligned with those that are taking the jobs that they have to do as seriously as we do.
You covered so much material there. I've got a ton of follow-up questions that sort of struck me as you were speaking. When I think about it, I mean, you really are a critical component of the broader pharmaceutical supply chain, looking at the core elements of storage, handling, and distribution. When you think back to sort of the pandemic and the growth and direct to patient, direct from patient, which you noted you're responsible for as well, we think about things like the Amazon effect and sort of expectations. I mean, these are patients, but they're also your customer's customer at the end of the day. So I don't know, could you elaborate on that? Sort of where do you see this going with direct to patient, DTP, DFP, and sort of what are the expectations in the industry, and how do you see technology evolving to support these types of critical moves?
It's really incredible what was done through COVID. And I think, unfortunately, we've lost some of the great lessons that we learned. And that was that we could coalesce and move faster than we ever really thought possible. But there was an absolute need to do that. I think the development of the vaccines to treat COVID are a great example of what the industry can do when it works together. It can move mountains. It can do a lot of things that we look at this industry. I think traditionally, pharma in particular, is slow moving in some ways, but there's so much going on the development side today. And when I think about what was able to be done for patients in need that couldn't get to hospitals, pharmacies were closed or had very limited hours at those hospitals. So we had to work very carefully to make sure that all of those coordination points, and believe me, there was a lot that was unexpected that we found on the ground and our drivers had to contend with. But what really I think we learned from that experience was that the collaboration is there if it's needed and warranted, and it can be effective, and it can scale up to many times of where it was prior to. And it's something now that, like you said, I think in my mind, I look at it as home delivery is a norm. It became a norm. There's been very interesting, when I look at the Amazon model just in general, how easy is it to order, right? How simple is it to get anything you need pretty quickly to your home? That's sort of the process that we're looking at for direct to patient. But at the same time, we have to be careful because there are blinding concerns for patients who can have access to that data. We also have to be very conscious that we are moving things that are very precision oriented around temperature, around the types of packaging that we need to use. So I think those are things that take us. It's not quite as easy to place that order as it would be through Amazon, but we try to make it as easy as possible because that is the gold standard in my mind of the order processing. We don't even think about placing orders with Amazon anymore, right? So we want to make it that easier, as easy as we can for the customers that are serving those patients.
That's so interesting. Again, you touched on so many elements. I mean, data security, data privacy, data accuracy. I mean, I know we've talked about this. I mean, clearly your drivers need to know where they're going, but at the end of the day, I imagine you're not retaining that personal data. You're purging that data, I imagine, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think the key for us is to make sure that that is also isolated when we're processing it to only those people that need to know. So who specifically is responsible for scheduling that shipment, coordinating it, understanding the routing, what's going to be required. Those individuals all need access and to be able to see where specifically something's going. The other interesting thing is when I step back, because we spend a lot of time focused on data privacy, and rightly we should, There's a lot of different regulations that go into that, whether it's personal privacy that GDPR regulates, or if it's more HIPAA oriented on the patient confidentiality element. But the thing that I always think about with clinical trials in particular is patients are opting in through informed consent. So they know that the courier is going to know where they are, yet we still are looking at protecting that data and isolating it to only those individuals involved. But when you think about also the process of delivering to a home, we don't necessarily even know if it's the patient or not. It could be their parent. It could be another caregiver, somebody else that's helping in the home. A lot of times what we're doing is coordinating this with nurses that are traveling around and visiting the homes. So when that's the case, we're definitely not knowing who the patient even is. So there's a lot of effort that goes into that, but I just wanted to point out that sometimes, well, in most cases, we have no idea who the patient actually is, but we do have to protect that address and make sure that that's not being published on our tracking information, for example. So we did have to advance our technology to have the ability to blind certain aspects to certain individuals.
As we sort of delve deeper into this topic of supply chain digitalization, could you share some thoughts on sort of what are you seeing in terms of investments around digitalization? What are you seeing? How does that differ from different geographies or different workflows or different segments of the supply chain? What are your thoughts there?
Well, there's definitely a variety of laws, even though GDPR is kind of the lay of the land and the landscape that we would like us to ascribe to globally from a personal privacy and data protection standpoint. There are different laws in places like France and elsewhere around the world where you have to be taking into consideration, again, could we use GPS to deliver to a patient's home? That's a fundamental question, right? Somebody has that data. And we know that, again, our driver needs to know where that patient is. But if we're using GPS, it allows us to leverage a lot about what's going on inside that shipment before we deliver it. So there's no surprises when you open the box in terms of temperature, but obviously it's tracking the location. So is there geofencing where we can make sure that that information in terms of where the patient address is something that's not being broadcast on tracking? That's something that we need to work through continuously, but I look kind of at the overall picture with supply chain, and GPS is really a guiding force for anything that's critical, anything that is of high value, and something that we really need to try and push for that use, particularly within cell and gene therapy. And I don't want to blur that with direct to patient because there are distinct similarities, but also differences between the two. And one of those is making sure we understand what's required per country, per geography, locale, for DTP in particular. But the cell and gene therapy piece for GPS just opens up a landscape of allowing us not only to have true up into where something is when it's on an aircraft or after it's landing from an aircraft, but also kind of thinking about this from holistically. We need to manage each milestone, and this is just another way for us to be more on top of exactly where something is. And it goes straight to the chain of identity, the chain of custody, which are paramount to cell and gene therapy materials.
So I want to build on this because I know this is a real specialty of your organization and builds on your many years of industry expertise. In preparation for today, we've talked about, or you've helped educate me on the complexity of cell and gene therapy distribution, and you've mentioned that up to 6 shipments may be required to produce or deliver one autologous, did I pronounce that correctly? Autologous cell therapy patient treatment. Can you share a little bit about sort of what are the challenges associated with managing such a complex supply chain with such a high value and critical product?
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding there's 2 extremely critical pieces to those 6 shipments, and one is the patient material that's drawn from that individual in the case of autologous cell therapies. So that's something that is then shipped and needs to be processed and manufactured and then shipped back. for the patient to be administered. So the key really is to make sure that that initial shipment of patient material is treated as if we're never going to have an opportunity to do this again, because in some cases that is absolutely the reality. It could be a tissue sample from a tumor. It could be a tumor. It could be a lot of different types of materials where a patient has gone through a very rigorous draw process that it could be a child. We don't want to have that become anything less than a viable material that has cells that are viable to produce that product. And then, of course, when it gets to the manufacturing center, there's this cycle that they have to go through to produce that drug, and then it's shipped back. So obviously, in that follow-up shipment to the patient of their actual product, again, that's the treatment. That's what we need to make sure is delivered. And those are right now in cell therapy. They're usually shipped cryo. So that does add a little bit of a complexity. But when I step back and think about the 6 shipments, a lot of that is involving the packaging supply and making sure that that packaging is returned back and recirculated into our inventory so that it could be used for another shipment down the line. So these are all really important pieces, but I wanted to highlight those 2 because they're absolutely critical, and we're kind of tasked to have no failures, make sure any possible contingencies are thought of in advance and discussed and even approved if necessary, because in some cases we're chartering aircraft. And that's something that obviously adds a ton of expense, but if it's at the expense of a very high value product and maybe the patient's life is at stake, that's something that we have to take very seriously and into account.
So to restate some of what you said, there are workflows and information flows around the movement of the life-saving medication itself, but there are also unique workflows and data flows around the movement of the packaging as well, because you're talking about high value, reusable LN2 doers or LN2 shippers that need to come back, get recharged, and get repurposed, correct, for other shipments as well.
Exactly. And to put it in really simple terms, I mean, just imagine you have the patient that has had their material shipped and it's been processed by the manufacturing center and needs to be shipped back. If that LN2 doer is not available at that manufacturing facility at the time that it is required to be picked up and then delivered back and then used for that patient treatment, the whole process, you've gotten so far down the road, right? So you have to make sure that you have the right materials at the right place. And the same is true at the starting point, right? When we're kind of picking up that initial patient draw material, the apheresis, that has to be managed so we're there before that package needs to be shipped with the proper preconditioned packaging. Usually the temperature monitor is already running, and we provide that and we're ready to go. But I think that kind of not emphasizing how important that is, that piece of it, to get the whole cycle started. We would be remiss in not kind of noting how critical that is to the whole process.
So there's visibility required around the inventory available from a shipper standpoint. There's information required to maintain a level of visibility around the status of the shipper itself in terms of its ability or preparation. Where do you see levels of or lack of digital integration today? Where do you see opportunities to help better streamline the flow of information around the movement of goods, whether it be the medicine itself or perhaps ancillary items that, like the shippers themselves, that are required as part of the treatment?
Well, one piece that I think that we have to do better at as an industry, and this has always been a little bit of a problem for clinical trials in general, and some people have done tremendous amounts of work to get it as right as they can, but how easily can you project what you're going to need, right? So, and for us, it's very critical that we're not very over or very under on these inventory projections for the packaging, and even just assessing the airline opportunities that we have to ship the various lanes. So there's digitalization opportunities and probably AI opportunities in both of these predictives, but there's also wild cards in that you can't really predict the instability of the airlines. For example, what flights are likely to be canceled. If we could get to a better place and know that based on passenger loads and things of that nature, that would be helpful. But I think when I think about this more so, it's fundamental. There's a lot of great tools out there, but very few of them are all connected. And that's really where we struggle the most, is that some of the suppliers that we work with are very open and have APIs they share, and we try to take those and share them as well to our customers. Temperature monitor data is one great example of that, where it's critical, particularly if it's GPS. If we don't have integration abilities and the APIs aren't shared or is open, that just presents another challenge. We have to get a separate link, make sure that link is, kind of moved around to all the right people that need to access that potentially. And just another step in the process, instead of looking at this as kind of, we're all working to the same goal here. Let's share the information and make it as open as we can, with privacy of the patient and confidentiality of that patient being respected as a paramount fundamental. But at the same time, I think we have a lot of work to do to connect all of us together that are involved. There's quite a few players in some instances.